Next speaker, Tim Moen. Tim's a globally recognized leader in ESG and sustainability, formerly as Chief Executive of the Global Reporting Initiative, or GRI, a framework we know well here at FedEx. I've known Tim for a long time, with more than 20 years experience leading sustainability at Intel, Apple, and AMD, and earlier experience leading development of federal environmental policy in EPA and the U.S. Senate. Tim has deep experience embedding sustainability strategy into business and government policy. His ESG and climate newsletter is required reading, and I look forward to the insights he will share with us today. Tim, over to you.
Thanks, Mitch, for that fabulous introduction. It's such a pleasure to be with you today, and especially with old friends like Mitch. We were sort of joking in the pre-session about how long we've known each other, and it's scary to count up the years. But you know, the wonderful thing is that we are at the most dynamic time in the history of this industry, if you can call it that. I just was laughing with some folks in New York last night at Climate Week that, you know, if you hang around long enough, things will tend to get better. And that's where we are with sustainability. It's gone from kind of this nice to do reputational issue into a must do for corporate boards, C-suites, just the entire economy. So I'm really happy to be with you today to kind of discuss that change and what it means to the procurement professional specifically. So again, thanks for that introduction. I wish we could be in person. As I mentioned, I was at Climate Week, and I think, Mitch, you're still there. And my gosh, there's no substitute for actually seeing people. So Mitch ran down this pretty well. I won't go through it again in the interest of time. I just want to highlight one particular career stop to kind of ground us, which was the Apple experience. And after about 12 years at Intel, I got hired by Apple to be their founding employee for their supplier responsibility program. And for those of you who remember those days, the company was kind of on the headlines of a lot of newspapers for alleged poor conditions in their supply chain. So it was really an incredible experience to go in there and sort of understand what the issues were, understand how to fix them, and to see the progress that was made. So I think that's the one experience that really connects my experiences to yours, and I want to leverage that as we go through today's conversation. So we'll move on and just try to, again, get through this, but I do want to make sure that you know this is an interactive conversation. I really would like to get into some discussion. It's always more fun that way, and I think we can tailor the information to your needs that way. So let's start with what is ESG. I think most people throw around the term, and they use a lot of different terms for this, but it probably bears a minute or two to really talk about what is ESG. I use this slide to kind of ground folks in the definitions. Of course, we know ESG is environmental, social, and governance. It's really how to measure sustainability and ethical impact. Again, those are big words that don't have a lot of meaning. I think anybody who's been in this business for a while knows that it has been an expanding scope of issues. You know, it started in my career with environmental issues when Mitch and I met way back when, and then it's slowly but surely been adding other issues in terms of social issues, governance issues, et cetera. And there are many different words that we use to describe it, from sustainability, corporate responsibility, corporate social responsibility, and now ESG. The point of all this is I don't personally get hung up on any of these names. I think they all can be used as synonyms, and it's kind of a waste of time, in my opinion, to try to parse them out between one versus the other. So when you really want to understand what sustainability is, I don't work there anymore, so I can extol the virtues of GRI. Global Reporting Initiative. I think many sustainability professionals will be familiar with this, because it really is the standard that drives sustainability reports and has for 25 years now. And just to give you a sense, and I always say, if you want to understand what sustainability or ESG is, read the GRI. So just very quickly, it gives you 10 principles that kind of form the framework. And that is things like, are you reporting on the most material things? Are you being complete about your reporting? Have you involved stakeholders? Those kinds of how-to issues are the reporting framework. But then you get into the actual standards, the what companies shall report. And there are 34 topics under the GRI standard. So it's a lot. And just to confuse people, it's not in ESG, it's in economic, environmental, and social. So again, we love to come up with our own acronyms in this space, but hopefully we'll have a decoder ring by the end of this presentation. And then finally, as you dive down a layer deeper, what you see in each standard is there's required disclosures, recommendations for disclosures, and then guidelines for how to disclose on that particular topic. So that gives you a little sense, but again, it's a very broad issue. If you really want to understand it, GRI is a good place to start. But the reason we're all here is not to kind of look back, it's to look forward. I have a podcast, and I had Aaron Kramer from BSR on the podcast. He's the CEO of Business for Social Responsibility. He said, sustainability is an overnight sensation, 20 years in the making. And he's right. I mean, we've been doing this a long time. So what's new? I mean, after all, 92% of the S&P 500 currently report on sustainability information. So what's new? What's new is that some of this information, not all of it, some of it has been determined as financially material for your corporations. And specifically, that has been climate change. It may be other issues in the future, but right now, everybody's focused on greenhouse gas emissions. And it breaks out this way. So GRI has always been focused on impacts to not only the company, but to people and the planet around the company. That's on the right side, the double materiality. On the left side, this is the new. So now all of a sudden we have the SEC and we have other regulators and standard setters looking at what are the impacts from the world to the company that could materially affect an investor's interests. That's called financial impact, financial materiality. And it's very, very different, right? And so that is the new, and that's what's causing all of this churn and change that we'll discuss and hopefully get into some questions on here in a minute. Again, a busy slide, but I'll just kind of sum up what's happening because of this change. Many of you probably are aware of this term, the alphabet soup of various standards that are out there for describing sustainability is rapidly consolidating, but it's unfortunately consolidating along those two tracks that I just mentioned. You have the Europeans moving forward with a new law that's going to require sustainability disclosure, but they're doing it on a double materiality premise. Whereas the rest of the world is looking at financial materiality specific to your audited and assured financial statements. And so, not surprisingly, the International Financial Reporting Standards, IFRS, which is used by 140 countries, almost all the countries except for the US. And the US uses GAAP and FASB, which is very close, actually. They're all coalescing around this new thing that was announced in Glasgow last November called the International Sustainability Standards Board. Very new. Still, the standards are in draft. But again, they're focusing on climate change. And many capital market regulators around the world are already saying they'll adopt the ISSB standard. So that's kind of where the world is going. And so let's talk about climate change for a minute, because obviously this is the one topic of the 34 that I mentioned before that has just risen up enough in terms of the concern from a financial standpoint to actually then cross that threshold from sustainability reporting, which is largely voluntary, into financial reporting, which is mandatory. It carries liabilities and must be audited and assured. So that's why people are really focused on this particular issue. Again, kind of a busy slide. I won't go through it all, but this kind of breaks down the climate reporting landscape. We just talked about the sort of second column over reporting standards and how that's coalescing in these two camps. Very few people talk about the accounting standards. The greenhouse gas protocol is the accounting standard and has been for over 20 years for companies that are disclosing their carbon footprint. That's not changing. And in fact, as we go forward and look at some of these mandates in the third column, many of the mandates are referring back to that accounting standard for companies as they disclose this information. So the greenhouse gas protocol is the only game in town right now. We can talk about where that is, but that is kind of the accounting standard. But what you see in the mandates is the US is moving forward. We'll talk about the SEC proposal, and the European Union is moving forward with new laws that will require disclosure in this space. So that is a big change, and it's going to affect just about every company on this call. So I just want to make that very clear. It's not just the US and Europe, but you have the British Financial Conduct Authority, Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan. They're all moving forward with mandatory, audited, assured, and integrated into your financial statements greenhouse gas reporting. So that's the big change. And then lastly, I'll just mention it, as this is all going on, because these disclosures have to be audited, we're seeing a big change in terms of the auditing and assurance standards that the Big Four are using to assure your reports. Again, I hope you're writing down a lot of questions, a lot of information flying here. So unless you've been on vacation for a while, you probably know that the SEC has issued a 500-page proposed rule requiring greenhouse gas disclosure in financial reports. That came out in March. Comment period is now over, and there's lots of speculation about what will happen and when will it happen. But this is the reason, and I want to make it clear, this didn't just spring out of whole cloth. It's not some woke idea from this administration. In fact, over 10 years ago, the SEC issued their first bulletin asking companies to disclose climate information because many institutional investors believe this information is material to their investment. So this has been going on for about 10 years. Finally, the pressure built to the point where the SEC issued this proposed rule. And one other point to really emphasize, because we always focus on the data, and we'll get into the data here in a minute, but before we do, I want to emphasize that most of the required disclosures are qualitative. They're about the structures, systems, processes within your company to understand and manage climate risk. And that's all apart from the data. The data has to fuel it, but you're talking about things like how is the board structured, informed, and how frequently they consider these risks, targets, goals, etc. All of these things have to be disclosed in this proposed rule. So let's talk about the numbers and the accounting for just 1 second. And this is where it will specifically get involved with procurement managers. This is the greenhouse gas accounting protocol that I mentioned before. It looks quite complex. Probably most people on this phone know of Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. Scope 1 and Scope 2, not controversial. That's the greenhouse gases from your own operations and the power that you purchase. Pretty simple. When you get to Scope 3 and you look at the greenhouse gas implications upstream and downstream of your company, that's where it gets complex. And that's where I think this particular audience would be most interested. And I've sort of highlighted that, you're really looking at value chain emissions, or supply chain, we could say, emissions. And those are quite difficult to not only procure, but to make sure that they're of a certain quality that you can rely upon them and include them in your financial statements. So this is kind of where the rub is right now. And to make it even more interesting, the Scope 3 emissions, as you might expect, are the majority of your greenhouse gas footprint. This is from Carbon Trust, a pretty broad estimate, but 65 to 95% of most companies, I guess that means more than half, are in scope 3, which is pretty huge. And then you can see this. This is my own editorial comments in terms of how to manage scope 3, but obviously leverage your buying power with your suppliers, engage these vendors, cascade the goals down, try to work together on joint goals, and then collaborate. I haven't mentioned the Responsible Business Alliance. It's something I was involved with setting up many years ago, but I truly believe that organizations such as Responsible Business and others are invaluable to trying to solve this problem. No one should go it alone, especially when it comes to scope 3. And I didn't mention this in the intro, but along the way I wrote a book. 2 chapters of that book are focused on the work that I did in the supply chain and how to set up and run those programs. These are some of the tips and tricks in terms of a code of conduct, building the code into your contractual terms, assessing the risk of your supply chain. So you're really focused on the biggest part of the problem and not chasing smaller parts of the problem. And then incorporating this into the actual selection of suppliers. And then some of the tips here on the right about running the program as well. But in terms of pro tips down below, look at getting an executive sponsor. You can't emphasize enough. Having tone from the top really matters in this space. I think most companies now are a little concerned about all this compliance talk. And so that should not be a big issue now. And then it's collaboration, internal collaboration, that I think that the door is open to sort of break down silo walls, because the sustainability department's been doing this forever. But it's new to the CFO, investor relations, the C-suite, marketing, et cetera. I mean, bring those people together. And I would view it actually as an opportunity, because all of a sudden you've got folks that you don't normally work with that you can work with to tackle these new challenges. Collaborate externally, I mentioned before, is a very big deal, and I can't emphasize that enough. And then working with outside players as well. I just cut and paste this article from the Harvard Business Review because I thought it was indicative of kind of where we are in the practice. Again, I won't read this to you, but basically the subtitle was the one that I thought was most telling. The sustainability distress call is coming from inside the house. And basically what this refers to is that notwithstanding the fact that we've been working on this for a very, very long time, many companies are underprepared. And that goes to some of the basics of education. What is climate change? Why is this important? Why do we have to do any of this? And you can see the stats there from that article. So I think starting with some of the basics of education, getting the folks who need to be involved up to speed, critical starting point. So what's coming? This is the interesting part. The SEC rule, again, the comment period ended in the summer. There's a lot of speculation over whether they'll get it done in, that should say second half 2022. I don't think so. I think it's going to spill over into 2023. That would be my guess, but it's just a guess. What's not a guess is that it will be litigated. There are several parties already that have said as soon as the rule goes final, they've got their lawsuits ready. So whether the court join the final rule or not, or allow it to proceed while the litigation proceeds, what's in the final rule, nobody knows this. And when the final rule comes out, that will determine when the actual compliance deadlines are. So if it were to be finalized this year in 2022, you would see disclosure in 24 for fiscal year 23, which gives you no time at all. So this is why I'm saying I don't think it's going to happen in 2022. I think it'll happen in 2023, but it will be litigated, and that will throw all kinds of uncertainty into the process. While this is happening in the US, the Europeans are not waiting around. There's been continual movement over there on the corporate sustainability reporting directive. Again, more stringent, than the US SEC rule, and it actually throws a bigger net. Some 50,000 companies will be covered by this, and as I highlighted on this slide, you don't have to be domiciled in Europe to be covered by the rule. You just have to business there over, and then you're covered by the rule. So this will have sweeping implications for many of us. But it's really important to go back to what I said earlier. This is all coming from investors. There's a picture of Larry Fink, who's the CEO of BlackRock, the largest asset manager, managing around 10 trillion US dollars, who issues an annual letter. And that letter said, access to capital is not a right, it's a privilege. And the duty to attract that capital in a sustainable way lies with the company. And I think, he's being very serious about that. He's been attacked as being woke, and he pushes back that it's not woke, it's capitalism. And big success stories in business will be sustainable innovators. So you can see the tension in his comments. And just want to emphasize that he's not alone. In Glasgow last November, there were 450 financial institutions representing 130 trillion US, like the whole economy, that signed up for a 2050 net zero goal. Now, I don't think many of them know how they're going to get there, but when you have that amount of money lined up behind net zero, it's something to pay attention to. But that's where all of these rules, laws, and standards are coming from. They're coming from investor pressure. And that's spilling over into this greenwash debate. We've seen the SEC pop out even more rules trying to look at greenwash or prevent greenwash. When financial institutions label a security as ESG, what does that mean? And do they really live up to that? Now you're seeing big headline grabbing cases of like raids in Deutsche Bank, police raids, and CEOs getting fired, et cetera, over greenwash claims or greenwashed claims. So I think it's really important to understand that greenwashing is a significant liability. So if you're making a goal, have the data to stand behind the goal. But there is a backlash, and that backlash is actually getting more and more serious. You've probably read about this. There's now 17 states that are passing laws against not only financial institutions, but companies that have quote unquote woke policies. So this is getting more and more serious. And you can see it's even made the pages of Dilbert recently. And the Supreme Court weighed in. Again, many of you probably know this, but in July, late June or early July, they weighed in with a decision that basically hobbled the EPA's ability to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from power plants. Having worked on the Clean Air Act over 30 years ago, this was painful, and we did not at the time include CO2 as a pollutant, and that's why the Supreme Court took that step, invalidating a previous Supreme Court decision that said it was in fact a health concern. Well, that got fixed, believe it or not, and many people don't know this, but just a few weeks ago, the Inflation Reduction Act, which was mainly a climate bill, despite its title, provided an amendment to the Clean Air Act, which put CO2 back in as a pollutant. So it's been a bit of a whiplash-inducing change in policy, but there you have it. So there's been a lot going on in this space. As I said, it's super dynamic, but the take-home messages for this audience are mandatory climate disclosure is here. I would not bet on whether this rule or that standard goes forward. It's coming, and now is the time to prepare for that. Investor pressure is what's making this all happen, and supply chain emissions scope 3 is really big. I mean, it's going to be the biggest part of these disclosures. So I think everyone on this call has a role to play in this future. And as I mentioned, it's time to prepare. Define and own what is your scope 3. Start building those bridges within the company so you can report up, find value. There's often hidden value when you start looking at these issues in the supply chain for the company from a dollars and cents point of view. And then, as I mentioned before, at all costs, avoid greenwash. If you're going to say it, back it up, because people will call you out on it. that's what I had to say to you today. I'm super happy to be with you again. It's just so gratifying to have been around this space for so long and to see it get so exciting at this time. But I am here to answer your questions, and thank you very much for including me in today's session.
Thanks so much, Tim. Really helpful. I think for a lot of folks on the call, this may be the first time that they've seen such a succinct, clear summary of all the stuff that's coming at their CEO. They may be getting the message from the C-suite. We need you to get galvanized. We need you to do this. But really helpful to know what that broad perspective is and all those different pressures that are weighing on leadership and kind of causing them to in turn weigh on supply chain management, procurement, and sourcing. So we've got a bunch of questions, and I not surprisingly, a lot of them are about how do we deal with the multiplicity of different data demands, these different regimes while we're in this period of flux, while we don't have kind of a winner, while the EU and the US are diverging somewhat in their reporting. What's a procurement person to do in terms of requests of suppliers for data? And I guess, the flip side of that is what's a supplier to do in terms of these multiple requests for data. I thought you might have some experience, at Apple, et cetera, thinking about that convergence of data.
It's a great question. And I think you can get lost in all these details. And certainly I do myself. I mean, it's so complex. But at the core of it is a fairly stable, as I mentioned, accounting procedure that, again, the 15 categories in scope 3 are fairly well known and haven't changed in quite a while. And so I think many of the companies on this phone can kind of rely upon that to start developing their own questionnaires, working in collaboration within their sector, developing standard questionnaires. I know EcoVadis does this, so that information can be exchanged between buyer and supplier. And that's a great place to start, is just to understand who's got data, what is it, do some quality checks, understand where the gaps are, but rely on the greenhouse gas protocol.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And here's an interesting one, because we have both public sector and private sector members. Obviously, public sector organizations are not subject to these reporting requirements in quite the same way. So I wonder if you could speak to how some of all this progress, let's look at it as, can really help public sector procurement in terms of, they're dealing with indirect procurement largely, but how can they kind of ride along on some of this?
I would say that public sector in this administration could be a leader rather than, following along, because there is so much momentum now with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act and all of the grants and other, incentives that are going out to really transition to a low carbon economy. All of this rides on data. And if you don't have good data, how do you know if you've been successful? You have to manage what you measure. So for me anyway, I think there's a great opportunity for the federal government to lead in terms of the methods and processes that we're asking each other about. A lot of this has been done by, let's just say, under-resourced NGOs that have, goodness at their heart. We need to take this over into sort of more of a rigorous, well-funded professional space if it's going to start entering into financial markets.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we're looking forward in just a moment to hearing from Betty Cremins about some of that alignment and impact from federal procurement. So great segue into that. Let me look before, we've got about 5 minutes. So I guess one question that comes up here is we've seen, it comes up for me, particularly having also worked in the electronic supply chain for about a decade and a half. We've seen the level of requirements and expectations of suppliers kind of on a constant rise. And I guess the question that occurs to me, and I know we've talked about it with members, is at what point does procurement, and particularly sourcing and supply chain, have a responsibility to not only require or request things, but also really get involved in capability building and even some forward-looking financing for suppliers in order to be able to roll up those emissions reductions at the procurement level.
Yeah, that's a terrific question. It's something that when I was at Apple, we clearly got into, because what you find as you want suppliers to step up to whatever bar it is, environmental, social, is that the capacity is not there. And if you want to move fast, you really need to help them build that capacity. And that's something that many big brands have done over time. And I think it can be even stronger through collaboration when lots of these buyers kind of gather together and say, well, let's not just act as a cop and find somebody doing something wrong. Let's act as a teacher and help people do it right. And I think that's a really positive way, because suppliers are in fact partners. They're business partners. We're all in this together. It's the biggest part of the footprint. So I truly believe that's the right way to go. So thanks for raising that. And I think it is best done through collaborative efforts.
Yeah. I'm going to, I think, call it there. Hang on. We have one more question coming in. Here's an interesting one. So how does waste generation fit in this big picture of supply chain emissions? We often think of it as just power related. Can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, it's actually one of the categories, one of the 15 categories I mentioned. So there's very little in terms of the corporate operations that doesn't get some sort of emissions factor so that you can calculate what the greenhouse gas implications are. Almost all corporate transactions result in some sort of carbon footprint. And so I always say carbon's a data problem. There's no one running around with a monitor trying to figure out like what your airplane is emitting, but you do the math and you can figure out what that flight to New York cost in terms of carbon. It's the same with waste. It's the same with water. It's the same with almost every transaction or action within a company or their supplier.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm sorry we're going to have to cut it there because I know people are excited to continue talking. We will definitely forward questions to Tim and also continue having these kinds of conversations with membership and others, because, if we're going to collaborate, we've got to come together. Every time we start talking about this stuff, it's gives rise to more ideas and more excitement. So thank you so much, Tim. And
my pleasure.
We will move on to our panel, who can give some really concrete examples of kind of how this works in action. So first, I am going to briefly turn it over to Joanna Anderson to remind us where we are in our schedule and what's up next.
Great. All right. So if you're just joining us, we are in the panel section of today's Collaboration and Innovation for Greenhouse Gas Reduction Deep Dive. So welcome. After the panel ends around 2:45 Eastern, there'll be a short break until the 3 p.m. start for the En-ROADS Deep Dive Workshop or one of the two SPLC invited sessions. And then when that wraps up at 5 p.m. Eastern, we will jump into our social hour. And regardless of whether you've joined a workshop or an SPLC session, please do join us back at 5 for some engaging conversation about today's topic or other things that you'd like to discuss with folks that are doing this challenging but inspiring work. Few more reminders. So you are in listen only mode. We do have the chat enabled though. So if you'd like to post comments in the chat, you can do that. If you have any questions though for the panelists, please be sure to put those into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom panel so that we can make sure that we get to those. Sometimes they get lost when they're in the chat. If you are registered for the En-ROADS Deep Dive or are joining an SPLC session, the invitation for those sessions comes from an SPLC email address, not from Eventbrite. So make sure you look for that. And again, return at 5 p.m. for the social hour. Now I'm going to hand back over to Judy Paneos, Senior Director of Sustainability and Supply Management at Sodexo and esteemed Chair of the SPLC Board.
Hi, everybody. Hello again. For those of you who didn't see me in the morning, at the beginning of this, Judy Paneos of Sodexo, as Joanna mentioned. Today's theme for the panel of the whole event is collaboration and innovation. We have this incredible panel put together to talk about the climate action that is needed today, right? And that all players need to be involved, public, private, NGO. We heard Renee talk about how I can show up as a guide, how we can show up to do this collective action. We've heard Tim talk about collaboration in many different ways, whether it's building a sustainable sourcing program, sector collaboration around reporting, building capacity in our supply chains. So it's very important that we think about this collaboration as well as innovation, right? Renee talked about being change leaders. We're talking about disrupting the way people think and do things now to change the things that are necessary to decarbonize our supply chains. So with the panel we've put together, we have a variety of different organizations that play different roles. Betty from the White House Council of Environmental Quality has a government perspective role, and I can't wait to hear more about how that government procurement function can help lead the collaborative work that we're looking at going forward to address climate change. Dexter from CDP is representing this amazing not-for-profit space that is helping lead how we do this work with our supply chains. Natasha from Pepsico has a multinational corporations procurement function represented on this panel. And Gary from Reaply, as a circularity platform provider, is disrupting this idea of consumption mentality. So I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves and how their orgs fit into the collaboration and innovation theme. And with that, I'm going to call on each of them one at a time to join the panel. First up is Betty.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be with so many familiar faces and new folks just joining this space, and really excited to continue this conversation, hopefully get into a dynamic panel conversation and bring in many more questions from all of you. Just a note of housekeeping, if you enter things in the chat, I cannot see them thanks to White House technology limitations, so I'm not ignoring you. Hopefully the moderators can help pass along the questions. But I'm thrilled to be joining you today, as noted, from the White House Council on Environmental Quality, one of the agencies of the Executive Office of the President. And we are just doing so much work here at federal government across all of our operations, taking a whole of government approach to achieving net zero emissions. So Tim just really expertly outlined some of the really important leadership work of the investment community. But I'm here to say I think procurement is where it's at. Purchasers and procurement officials are going to save the world, and it's up to us to drive towards net zero emissions well before 2050. So as mentioned, I work at the White House Council on Environmental Quality, but I specifically work in a really unique office of the Office of the Federal Chief Sustainability Officer. We run a sustainability shop here inside government, just like every other company in the world. We just happen to be massive. So we have a goal of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions across all of federal government, net zero by 2050, but a 65% reduction by 2030. That includes things that my amazing colleagues are leading, like transitioning our fleet of, I think, 600,000 vehicles towards all 100% zero emission vehicles in the coming years, switching to 100% 24/7 real-time carbon-free energy everywhere that we purchase power across all government and military operations, transitioning our 400,000 buildings towards net zero buildings, and then a ton of work on resiliency and adaptation, knowing that business continuity at the federal government is paramount critical. we are the backstop of everybody else's risk mitigation plans and insurance policies, and the National Guard needs to be there to deploy whenever all other systems fail. So a lot of work on building resiliency and adaptation through every level of government. We are the largest of a lot of those. We are the largest purchasers in the world. So we spend $650 billion a year, and I have the great fortune of co-leading our portfolio to move that $650 billion of spend towards net zero by 2050. I have no idea how to calculate it. I have no idea how to achieve it, but I know there's a lot of steps we need to do to be able to get there. And so we're putting a lot of those in place now. Sustainable procurement and sustainable purchasing is not new to federal government. We really started, back in the 70s, thinking about recycled content. That's evolved to a lot of environmentally friendly purchasing processes for products and services. But in the last 10 to 15 years, we've really begun to encapsulate that within a broader strategy around supply chains and sustainable procurement more broadly. So when I think about how we're working on sustainable procurement, I sort of bucket it into three areas. Nobody has told me not to frame it this way. I haven't thought of anyone else doing it, but feel free to tell me if I'm wrong. So I think about who we buy from, what we buy, and how we buy. And we're sort of thinking about how we address all of those areas right now, this critical decade of action in the process towards 2050. So just briefly, and we can get into more in the questions, who we buy from, that's our suppliers. Those are our critical suppliers. We have 85,000 plus of them, expanding things like aerospace and defense, IT. We buy a lot of pharmaceuticals and vaccines now. We buy a lot of engineering services. And so since 2016, we've been actually engaging our suppliers through CDP supply chain to begin to get data from those suppliers. And I'm now working on a tasked by executive order FAR case for the federal acquisition regulation that will actually mandate three specific things from our major suppliers. One, disclose greenhouse gas emissions across scopes 1, 2, and relevant categories of scope 3. 2, do a TCFD aligned risk disclosure and disclose it through CDP publicly. And 3, to set a science-based target. So we can talk more about what that will mean for federal suppliers and their suppliers. That's the who we buy from. The next bucket is what we buy. That's things like the environmentally preferably purchased program. So things like labels of eco labels for products and services, bio-preferred, Energy Star labels, water sense. There's all sorts of labels that we in government, and we've validated third parties, and we work to ensure we purchase them to the maximum extent possible. Last week, we also announced our first buy clean policy for construction materials like concrete and asphalt and steel. We're the largest buyer of a lot of these things in the U.S., and that's before the bipartisan infrastructure law went into place. So now we're going to be buying a whole lot more of them, and we can't build clean infrastructure, energy systems, transport systems without clean materials. And then the third bucket is how we buy. That's the really fun stuff. That's where we think about how we contract, how we source things, how we plan for acquisition, how we engage our 60,000 acquisition professionals across government, and how we really think about shifting the mentality and using procurement as a mechanism to drive action on climate, not just accounting for the issues, but really driving action towards net zero. So ready to answer all sorts of questions about all of that, but I'll pass it on to the next panelist.
Betty, thank you. Next up in the order, once again, to give us this quick intro, is Natasha from Pepsico. Thank you, Natasha, for joining us.
Thanks, Judy. Hi, everyone, and thank you very much for this opportunity to talk with you all today and converse about sustainability and the power of procurement. Perhaps before I kind of go deep into Pepsico, just to share with you that I started my own journey in sustainability about 17 years ago, pretty much when it was a bit of a buzzword, and a bit of a nod to Tim is that, yep, it has been an expanding scope of issues over that time. I joined PepsiCo about 5 years ago, really working in the sustainable agriculture under sustainability office. And whilst I was there, I worked very closely with procurement. And that is where I thought, okay, this is really where the power, the drive, the action is going to happen to enable us to address, some of those really big issues around climate change. And how do we do that? So about a year ago, I was appointed Director Global Procurement Sustainability. What that means is that PepsiCo has really seen the importance of sustainability, and we have a whole team under global capabilities that sits in procurement to really work alongside and with all of our procurement colleagues, but also in that cross-functional. So, you know, the theme is about collaboration. Yes, collaboration needs to happen on the external world, but also internally with your cross-functional teams. And so our role as Global Procurement Sustainability is to engage and educate our GP colleagues and our suppliers, because we saw earlier, I think it was Renee that touched on it, is, you know, we do need to see this increased need of sustainability literacy, because we all need to understand where we are going and what's going to take us on that path and what are the steps that we need to take. The other really key part of the team is to formalize that supplier sustainability engagement. And, you know, that really starts with data, which I can talk a little bit about, you know, in the next session after my colleagues have introduced themselves. But, you know, where procurement really sits as well is that, you know, our role is to embed sustainability KPIs into commercial agreements, but even to go further than doing that, because you need to ensure that everyone is on a learning path, understands the requirements, and also we need to understand who of our suppliers and our partners we need to really work closely with. So, you know, it's that real step change in collaboration and partnership that you're seeing from, you know, some of the big consumer goods companies. And earlier this year, we announced our supplier ask, which is around by the end of this year, report scope 1 and 2 emissions, because that's our scope 3 emissions. Work together with us on a regenerative agriculture plan. And by the end of 2023, set those science-based targets and convert that, you know, that Pepsico portion of electricity load to renewable electricity. You know, we've put those asks out there with our suppliers, but it's also really important that, you know, we need to go on that journey with them together. So we have developed a number of educational resources and programs for both internally and externally for our suppliers. So thank you for the introduction.
Well, that list of what you want from your suppliers sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it, Betty? I think it was almost letter for letter there, with the addition of that regenerative ag, which is so exciting. Okay, so next up in intros is Gary from Repley.
Hi, all. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm very, very excited about this conversation. So I'm Gary from Repley. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Repley. For you all who don't know Repley, Repley is a company based in Chicago that builds technology to help organizations with reuse as kind of a larger kind of chunk of helping organizations get to circularity. And what that means, in kind of a really short story about me, is it started in a very weird industry called academia. So about 7 years ago or so, I started a reuse program at Northwestern, which is where I was doing my graduate work. I'm in Chicago. And it turns out that the problems that universities have with siloed or departments, multi-campuses, people purchasing things that they shouldn't, people throwing away things that they shouldn't, is pervasive across the kind of corporate landscape. So what Repley does today, not just with universities, with brands and companies that you all either work at or know, is we help organizations reuse things they've already purchased over and over and over again. And then when you can't use something internally, our technology allows you to connect to nonprofits, small businesses, especially disadvantaged ones, peer organizations, to take those items from you so they can be reused at those organizations again and again and again. And then when those items can't be reused at all, we have a whole network of recyclers who can then responsibly take those items and recycle them. And then we help you report on the scope 3 or embodied carbon associated with reuse, the money saved, and the waste diverted from landfill. So we're all about reuse. If you take nothing from everything I say today, I will overuse the word reuse. is actually in my name, #reuse. One of the thoughts that I had about how do we move forward from a collaborative and innovative perspective from a sustainable procurement lens is this word reuse. And what we see a lot of times is organizations have very slick, beautiful ways of procuring things. They worked on that for many years. But actually, there really isn't as well structured ways to reuse the items that they purchased within these companies. And so, especially in a world of broken supply chains, especially in a world where almost every company is thinking about how do we drop our bottom line, how do we cost cut, at the same time, at the same time, how do we try to hit or maintain our goals towards 2030, 2040, 2050? And so our kind of take on that is to digitally connect your organization. So if someone is in plant A and you're in plant B, you should know what they have before you go making a purchase. Even just the knowledge set of that allows for more collaboration and potentially more innovation within your organization. And so we're all about sharing. We're all about bringing visibility to the things that you've already purchased in hopes that those things can be either reused within your organization or within your community. I'm so excited for the conversation and looking forward to hearing from other panelists as well.
Thank you. It reminds me of, coming from a family of 4 kids, the clothes went down the line and then to the next family next door who had younger kids. So reuse, and then find someone else in the community to reuse. I love it. I'm a huge fan. Okay, next up is Dexter from CDP. CDP has been mentioned quite a few times on this panel already.
That's right. Well, thank you. It's such a great pleasure to be here. It's really great to see so many familiar faces and lots of names that I recognize from our work at CDP. So just really excited to get into the discussion. And as the youngest of 6 children, actually, I'm very familiar with the concept of reuse. Unfortunately, I was at the receiving end of many hand-me-downs over the years. But very, very happy to contribute to this discussion today. I'm really excited to get into it. Just very briefly, I'm sure many of you are familiar with CDP, but we're the international not-for-profit, all about environmental disclosure. We started as the Carbon Disclosure Project. We did pretty much exactly what it said on the tin, carbon disclosure, and then we expanded into water and deforestation. And by 2025, we have the ambition to expand into all areas of environmental disclosure, which will be a critical part of our expansion, but we won't be looking at anything else in the ESG landscape. We will continue to just focus on the environmental area. That is very much our USP. So I lead our corporate engagement work globally at CDP, but my heart is in the supply chain space very much. So I came to CDP and I helped to get our supply chain program off the ground in 2008, and subsequently led that program from 2011 until 2017. It's still very much part of my remit. And it's growing massively at the moment. We have over 282 members in 2022, with a combined annual procurement spend of over $5.5 trillion. Of course, Betty represents a significant chunk of that, the US federal government. We've also got the government of Japan through the Ministry of Environment, most of the big retailers and big household names, all using the CDP platform to engage their supply chains. And that's a really critical piece of learning that I've seen over the years, is the importance of standardization. And we'll see that come through in our discussions today, I'm sure. But the GHG protocol is used by the vast majority of our disclosing companies. 86% of all disclosures report in line with the GHG protocol. We've seen a huge growth in the number of disclosures all over the world, massive growth in Asia in recent years. But in 2021, I saw we sent the request out to 23,000 suppliers. And just this last year, 2022, we sent the request out to over 40,000 suppliers. So there's a massive growth in the number of companies being requested to respond to CDP at the moment. And that will yield very significant data. There's a massive increase in the quality of that data. But as we move into the discussion, I don't want to take up too much time, but we've got 8 years to reduce emissions by 50%. It was encouraging to hear all the work that Betty's doing and the government, US federal government are doing to really affect change in their portfolio right now. And I think that urgency is coming through in a lot of our discussions at the moment. We've really got to move into the action space as quickly as humanly possible. Some of the great frameworks that we've got at the moment, the Science-Based Targeted Initiative, have been really powerful in pushing more requirements down the supply chain. It's great to see Natasha mandating for key suppliers to have science-based targets by 2023. And these are all the sorts of initiatives that we see. But we need to help the procurement teams in these organizations really get to action. And the data that facilitates that action is critical. And one of the things that I kind of pushed to the side at CDP for some time was our work on lifecycle emissions. But I think that's going to be increasingly important to get carbon emissions data over the life cycle of products. So we have the original principle of the Scope 3 protocol, which was to have that three-dimensional view, which was the corporate level disclosure and that product life cycle data. And I think that product lifecycle data is going to become increasingly important. And that's why we've launched a product ecosystem recently with BCG, which is free to the world to use. We'll be launching it properly at COP, but it's just an FYI here. That tool will be available to all teams that want to understand their lifecycle footprint in their supply chain. And I think that type of information can facilitate more direct interventions across the supply chain, because at this point, we're all just really impatient for more action on this topic.
Okay, wow, you guys are great, because I had a bunch of questions prepared and you've answered some of them already. But I want to go, let me take a look and see where we can start here. So I do want to do a call out to Betty. The power of procurement, supply chain is everything is supply chain. Absolutely, right? I mean, it just gets me so excited to be working in this space right now. Okay, so when we think about this collaboration and innovation, I'm going to skip this question because you guys have answered it already. But if I'll ask this of anyone who wants to answer it, but a success story or challenge they've had around collaboration and kind of how, or partnership and innovation, maybe how that turned out. And I know, Natasha, we heard that you at PepsiCo have developed some of these tools for capacity building. So I'd love to hear from you specifically on that in this space of a good story around collaboration. So do you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. So so how many stories would you like? I suppose that's my first question.
I know we could be here all day, right? Which is good.
Here all day. But perhaps I'll just, I'll give a bit of a headline first and then talk you through some of the resources that we have in place. So and you may have seen in Bloomberg, I think it was like last week or a week ago, that PepsiCo and ADM have signed a 7.5-year agreement to work in a number of different states across a number of different crops, really linked to regenerative agriculture and GHG. And that's where you kind of go, right, so this is the power of procurement and working with sustainability and that collaboration both internally but externally. And that's where, our suppliers or our partners are aligned with our goals. And we know that actually we all need to work together here. We all need to move as one. And so that's, a really, we're very proud of that agreement. And we're really looking forward to kind of getting in there and and starting that work, whether it's from, working with farmers and the education piece, field trips, really making a significant change and a significant difference. And that's where the focus needs to be, is, where can we put our efforts? Where can we put the laser focus? Because that's the difference. That's, that action is going to drive the difference that we're looking for. And then, to your other question, Judy, around resources and suppliers and how we're really engaging with them, I'll share with you kind of two things, actually. One is that this year we held our first global supplier forum where we brought our suppliers in via Zoom, okay, but we brought them in and we kind of lifted the lid, right, and said, and we're very open and honest and transparent about, what are some of our challenges? How can we work together on sustainability, on innovation, on collaboration, but also to really recognise them for, working with us over the past 2.5 years and before that, with all of the various challenges that we've had to address and are still enduring. And part of that was really, okay, we have set these targets. We now need to ensure that we are equipping both ourselves and our partners, our suppliers, on really understanding, what's the benefit of setting a science-based target, right? What does it really mean? What does it mean for a company? So we worked in partnership with Mars and McCormack to set up the Supplier Climate Leadership Transition School. And, that's run by Guidehouse. Then we created a sustainability action centre, which is for those suppliers, who really want to learn more, but not quite ready to go into such an intensive program, such as SLOCT. And that's a digital library full of resources. And then we launched a positive agriculture playbook. And that's about regenerative agriculture, because, so our scope 3 emissions are also at that agricultural level. We're in ag, Pepsico. So we really need to get in there with our suppliers and our farmers and work with them to really, for them to understand, their footprint and how to make those changes. And then in partnership with Schneider Electric, we've created a program called PEP RE Renew program, which is about renewable electricity, and how we can join together is, in how do you set up a power purchasing agreement? Who do you look for in that cohort? Which market is that available? Where do you start your journey on renewables? And so they're, some of the 4 programs that we have in place, which are really linked to our supplier ask, which we believe are some of the, multiple, there's a multiple of levers that we can all pull to reach our targets and our commitments, but it's not one lever that's going to do the lot, right? There's no miracle out there, right? And I'm sure we all know that. We need to pull multiple levers at multiple times.
Yeah, and I like that it sounds like you clearly identify kind of where your biggest impacts could be across the continuum suppliers. So I'm impressed. That's great. Who else wants to share a story?
I'm happy to jump in, Judy. So like Natasha, we have a lot of stories. We love stories. And quite frankly, that's I think the beauty of thinking about being green, thinking about being sustainable in a procurement workflow. There's actually really a lot of wins that you can get immediately. And so I've not cataloged them all, but I will share we have kind of a case studies page that people could kind of go and kind of get literally everything that we can share. There's some things that we can't share that are also exciting, but some things that come to mind. So on the cost savings, so I think about sustainability and procurement, circularity, kind of in 3 buckets. So $1, right? We're talking about procurement. How can we use this to create either spending avoidance or taking money and buying other things that we don't need to repurchase? The other is kind of waste. And then the other for us at Reply is kind of on the carbon side and scope 3 embodied carbon. So So on the, one that comes to mind for me is at Nicor Gas in Chicago, which serves all the suburbs. They're the utility company in all the suburbs. I think in 6 months with our reuse program, just internally, we've saved them almost $900 million. Which, think about 6 months, $900 million, not even the city of Chicago, just the external suburbs that we've been able to do that with just internally. When I think about waste, I think that we've, just at Rush University in Chicago, one of the smallest hospitals in Chicago, we've been able to, I think we did about 27 tons of waste diversion in 3 months there with the reuse program. When I think about when I think about carbon, I think about the work that we're doing in the built environment at Google. And some of those things I actually can't talk about publicly here, but what I will say is, as you all know, there's so much embodied carbon and literally embedded in the purchasing of net new building material and kind of, fixtures, furniture, and equipment, things that we sit on or work on. And so what I'll say is that, broadly speaking, what we want to do at Reaply and we've been doing is tell that to the masses being the people who are at the companies that you work in. So if people know, hey, here's a better sustainable option. Hey, here's the goals that we as a company are trying to achieve, an organization are trying to achieve. And here's the win stories, right? Here's someone who's done that. It was super easy. We think that kind of three-pronged strategy converts super believers to evangelists and converts people who are kind of skeptical to believers. And so we're trying to do that with technology, but those are kind of, 3 bullets that come to mind that I kind of keep here, but, provided that link for a more comprehensive kind of storytelling at Reaply.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I was listening to you and I was like, wow, procurement shouldn't end at the delivery of what we bought, right?
Yes.
How do we internally procure? How do we think that way? So,
and just to add on to that, Judy, one of the things that the folks at Google have helped us with messaging is, how do we become our own supplier, right? Because if we've bought stuff and we can reuse that, have it remanufactured and then reuse it again, then we actually literally slash our scope 3 risk. So just as a theme about how powerful reuse and circularity can be is, think about being your own supplier for whatever category that you're thinking about.
Yeah, you just got to be careful you don't start charging yourself.
That's right.
I have departments that will do that. Okay, so we have so many questions coming in, so I'm going to jump to audience questions unless there's something burning, Dexter or Betty, you want to share right now. Shall we jump in, or?
I'd say go ahead.
Okay, cool. All right. So, question for Betty. Well, also CDP for your work with CDP. What are the Are there challenges with participation costs as a barrier? Right. Some people have experienced this with organizations like EcoVadis. Right. So how do you reconcile that challenge in getting suppliers to participate in these collaborative actions, particularly in this disclosure space and around CDP?
Do you want me to take that first, and then maybe Dexter wants to add?
Yes, if you take it, then I'll get Dexter's perspective. It's just cool to have both of you
Absolutely. So I'll say a few things about supplier disclosure. I think Tim really excellently laid out some of the work that the SEC is doing to build upon the investor need for really standardized, comparable data for capital markets. And that's been a long, ongoing work stream where investors have been getting increasingly sophisticated on the data they need and how that will need to play out into financial filings. And that was the sort of the genesis of CDP. I would say supply chain needs a very different perspective on data, and not very different, but uniquely different. So we need transparency, accountability, and action. So as we think about our own supply chain, we need to understand where the greenhouse gas emissions lie and where the risks lie, and then what our suppliers are doing to take action on those, so that we in turn can then shift our procurement, shift our purchasing, shift our acquisition planning to take into account what companies are doing, our critical contractors and subcontractors, what the federal government is doing, and then in turn there's sort of an interplay on this whole theme of collaboration, right? As companies are thinking about their transition plans, they for long had to go it alone. Now, as the federal government is starting to think about investing in charging infrastructure, in in renewable energy infrastructure, in transport infrastructure, companies can integrate that into their transition plans. So we think about the data and the disclosure quite differently. And that's why, as we're thinking about disclosure from our suppliers, we're looking to what the market is doing. My boss, the Federal Chief Sustainability Officer, says here at federal government, we are leading from behind. Because we know we waited it out for 4 years. We really didn't. We asked suppliers to disclose the CDP. We didn't do much with the data, to be honest, for the last 4 years. There wasn't a sort of federal mandate. But now we are all systems go towards net zero. So that's why we're looking to these third-party systems that companies have already been using. We're trying not to add any additional burden on suppliers to do the disclosure they've already been doing. We're just sort of asking them to be more comprehensive and transparent. And if you think about our federal supply chain, we buy a lot of aerospace and defense. We buy a lot of engineering contracts. We buy a lot of construction materials, things that maybe sectors that hadn't been asked to disclose before. And so I've been mapping a lot of our supply chain. Of our top 100 suppliers, a lot of them are publicly traded. A lot of them are household name brands you've heard of. It's all public: Lockheed, Boeing, Raytheon. It's more household names. As you get deeper into our supply chain, still massive contracts in the multi-million dollars per year. Those are companies that you've just never heard of. They offer some type of marine services or security services to the federal government. And that's where we need to really energize those companies. So yes, there'll be a cost of disclosure. There'll be a cost of figuring out what greenhouse gases are, setting up an accounting system. But that's where we think we'll have the biggest cost savings and the biggest emissions reductions, because those are the companies who have not gotten started and have all that low-hanging fruit. So yeah, we need to help the leaders progress and set more ambitious science-based targets, cascade this, et cetera. But we really get to now focus on those companies you've never heard of that are critical to our delivery of federal supply. Dexter, I don't know if you want to address anything else on cost.
Yeah, I think I just want to kind of back up what you're saying, Betty, because one of the reasons I'm still at the CDP after all these years is that I have the privilege of seeing smaller organizations starting out on the journey of disclosure and really using the CDP questionnaire as a framework for setting a strategy. So it's not about perfect data, actually. And of course, at the S&P 500 level, where the data is used as in Bloomberg terminals and underpins a whole network of ESG data providers. But really in the supply chain space, it's about that journey that the suppliers undertake. And they get quite clear messaging from their customers to say, listen, in year one, it isn't actually about the perfect data. It's more about getting started on this journey, understanding where you are, and then really getting quickly to action. Because we shouldn't fetishize data in this way. I mean, perfect scope 3 data is not really that useful in any world, really. So it's really about identifying where to make the right interventions in the supply chain, how you can find opportunities for partnership. There's when we look at a lot of our long-term disclosing entities, we see that for the key suppliers, there's not a lot of change in the long-term supplier list for some of the key suppliers. And those collaborative projects that have kicked off around renewables, for example, or energy efficiency projects, or just emissions reductions activities, they're really embedded now as a key part of that customer-supplier relationship. So it's to be a bit cheesy, it's kind of about the journey. It's not necessarily about the data as a destination, right?
But at the same time, getting that data helps you take action, right?
Yes,
and
there's a cost to it, to come back to. Core. It's a procurement group after all, right? So there's a cost too. There's going to be a cost to building the systems out to get this information, but arguably, if you're doing business in the US or in Europe, you're going to fall into some sort of mandatory reporting regime at some point. So building a structure to get energy data from your various facilities is pretty important, frankly. So and then understanding what your supply chain is doing. It's about building those capabilities over time. There isn't a cost to disclosure on supply chain to CDP. but there is a cost to all of the associated activities for sure. And so you could look at some of the big investor disclosures from S&P 500 firms, like the very comprehensive disclosure that we get every year from PepsiCo, for example. That's a significant undertaking, and arguably some of their smaller suppliers wouldn't be investing the same level of resources into something like that. But they know that they need to report on their scope 1 and 2 emissions. They know that they need to report work towards setting a science-based target. So they have the very involved CDP request, but they have the more targeted requests within that.
Yeah, and I think and I start to think about getting this down, and there's some questions in the chat and everything here around getting it down to the product level, the line item level, right? And in procurement, if you're managing a category, that's something you want. So you can compare apples to apples, right? So you can make that procurement decision. We're not going to get there right away. How do you see this journey in getting there to the point in a way that isn't going to be a barrier for those people who can't get there quickly, right? In particular, these smaller companies.
So I think it requires a lot of the communication from the customer themselves to understand, so that the suppliers understand how the data is being used. So as Natasha identified earlier, they have key requirements of their suppliers. Scope 1 and 2 disclosure is a must, right? But relevant elements of Scope 3, as Betty's doing in the federal government as well, and then setting a science-based target in the case of PepsiCo is a critical piece for the supplier. So it's about focusing them in on those key elements of the journey that they really need to focus on. And some other, if I think back at some of our other member organizations and how they engage with their suppliers, some of them are very much risk focused, right? So there's what seem like really challenging elements of the CDP questionnaire that other members don't focus on. Some of them are really focused on the risks and adaptation elements of the questionnaire. They want to be sure that their suppliers have thought about the extent of climate risk that they face, how they're managing that risk on behalf of their customers, and what their strategy is to address that risk. So it's different customers have different data expectations or different journeys that they use the standardized CDP framework to engage with their suppliers, but many track very different journeys.
Gary, I can chime in a little bit on this.
Oh yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just going to chime in a little on that interplay between sort of product level data and project or contract level data and corporate level data, because we've been thinking a lot about that on our own federal spend as well. And I think it really depends on the category and the product and where the emissions lie. So for some things, like we don't think about it this way in government, but for corporations, there's direct spend and indirect spend, right? For indirect spend, you kind of just want to know that you're buying from the right companies and they're not going to go out of business because they haven't managed their risk or their energy spend. You don't really need to know about the products themselves. It's sort of more about the vendors that are providing data to you. Direct spend are the materials you're buying to actually run your business, and that's where you need to know about those material flows specifically, and you want to make sure you have the right strategic partners, especially if they're single source or sole source. But more so, you need a lot more granular data on the products that they're providing right into your value chain that are then going to your customers. So I'm so thrilled that Natasha is really doubling down on agriculture, because that's somewhere that they can really address it. And just asking that major supplier for their overall data is not going to be sufficient. They need to get down to the granular, literally on the field, to flow that action. Here at federal government, we're thinking of the same thing. So we need to have that baseline understanding of our major federal contractors more broadly, their TCFD overview, their scope 1, 2, and 3. But then there's specific products that we buy that we need to know about the embodied carbon of that product. So I mentioned buy clean around construction materials. We're not actually buying concrete and steel. We're buying design build contracts with engineering firms who maybe 2 or 3 tiers in their value chain are going out and purchasing cement and steel. But in aggregate, government in the U.S., federal, city, and state, is 46% of the concrete purchasing. Wow. So we are half of the market, which means you guys and the private sector are the other half of the market.
Right, you define what that spec is. Yeah.
And so if but we're not engaging, these Wholesome and Lafarge and US Steel, we're not engaging those companies directly. We have no contracts with them. So that's where we need to take a product focus and get that embodied carbon analysis so that the data can flow through the value chain, so that we know by the time it hits one of our construction sites, that's where we know we're preferencing lower carbon materials. So I think it's just going to depend on the sector and the type of procurement that you're thinking about. Obviously, corporate level data is sort of table stakes. I think you need to start there, but you can't stop there for many areas of your spend.
So Gary, this idea of embodied carbon, right, is the space you live in, right? In trying to avoid, let's not pull in more embodied carbon. Do you want to elaborate a little on that?
Yes. So we, for about 2 years, have been working on bringing kind of in real time embodied carbon avoidance calculations to our reuse program. We worked with a couple consulting firms. We worked with Microsoft. And in the spring of this year, we rolled it out as a part of our tool. So in particular for the built environment. So as Betty was talking about construction materials, building materials, that's our jam. So essentially, the way that we see this working is if you want to know what is your total embodied carbon kind of accounting at your organization, at your company, at your small business, anyone in between, that helps you at least start thinking about how do I not accumulate more of that? And so that already gets you thinking of what can I be reusing? Can I use these ceiling tiles or these doors or these windows or these floor plans in a new in a new renovation of another office? Or can we just store them somewhere and use them somewhere else as we think about building over the coming years? And I think there's a quickness to always thinking about new build and renovation as net new, when it doesn't need to be net new. A lot of the organizations we actually work with buy way more building materials that they ever need for a project. They're stored in some kind of mysterious place. And then someone doing a project either on campus or, quite frankly, another organization in their community looking for those same materials, having a hard time right now, because in the supply chain world, the building materials are kind of the hardest thing to get right now. But they're now sourcing that new when they can actually be sourcing for a community partner and or within their own organization. Again, dropping that embodied carbon emissions to zero from a net new purchase. So the way that we kind of think about at Reaply is two ways. Can you reduce purchasing, meaning purchase less? It's a cost saving spend. It's obviously a scope 3 win. But then if you can't, can you purchase things that have already been purchased? Like someone, whether in your organization or someone that you trust in your network, has already purchased. And so those are the really two things that we think knowing about embodied carbon emissions and reducing kind of plays into. And then one other thing that I wanted to say on the supplier side, because I know there's, obviously, we struggle with this too, is getting more data, getting more standard data from suppliers down to the vendor level. The thing that I'll say is just more wholesomely, we have to be more connected as a value chain. If COVID showed us nothing, was that how not connected we really are. And when I think about the recursive relationship between a vendor and a supplier, it can't just be they send products and they send data. Why not send products back to the supplier, right? Letting the supplier know, hey, we're about to get rid of this. Shouldn't they be able to take that back and not to have a whole contract around there? Couldn't it just be a recursive digital relationship? So we've been trying to think both about how can we bring the carbon data from an embodied carbon, at least, to kind of, again, highlight this problem and get people to action. But on the broader scale, it's how can we get suppliers, vendors upstream and downstream on the same platform, sharing the same information to kind of really make the kind of ideals of circular economy and circularity come together. Sorry, I took more time than I probably should.
No, I think that's great. I mean, it's like you keep thinking about how you expand this community, right? Not just within the consumer set, but also in different places of the supply chain. I love that. I'll leave it to Gary to be disruptive, right? Natasha, I have a question for you. So from one of the attendees, the question is, how successful have you been in getting the reporting requirements in your contract language? There's a lot of questions in here. Tracking your compliance. Are you doing it through a third party internally? How big is your team? So very, very much a lot of details, but how do you manage all this? You've set these goals, you've given them some tools, but then how do you make it happen when you've got maybe challenges in getting information or action?
Yeah, sure. And I think the first part is that, we need to start at the beginning, right? So we started with data, okay? And we looked at our entire universe of suppliers, right? And then we, mapped that, then thought, okay, we can't work with all of those suppliers, right? We're not going to ask every single supplier to report, on scope 1 and 2 emissions, right? If they're the tiniest supplier that, provides us with, a very small ingredient, right? So we looked at packaging and ag suppliers. They're our biggest footprint, okay? And we said, okay, let's determine of all of those suppliers, let's look at their GHG, let's look at their acres, let's look at their renewable electricity. Are they reporting against scope 1 and 2 emissions? Are they using CDP for that reporting tool? And really understand, actually, where do we need to focus, right? And so what that does is it gave us an ability to see of all of our suppliers, we need to focus on the 80% who contribute to the GHG emissions, right? And so that's where that's the beginning of our journey. So when we launched PepsiCo Positive about a year ago, that's where we started to map and really think about, okay, how are we going to determine the top 20% that drive 80% of those emissions? Who are those suppliers? Where are they in the world? And actually, what's our level of relationship with them? Because it is about that collaboration and innovation, right? And that's where, the whole power of procurement comes into play, right? And so, we set the targets, we've worked on the data, we now understand what that footprint is, and now we're starting to think through, okay, we need to, understand how we're going to, retrieve that information, make it work for us, make it work for the supplier, but also make it work, for planet and people, right? I mean, that's what we're all driving towards. That's the ultimate goal.
Right. I mean, in my mind, I always think about it as all comes down to people, right? The planet will go on without us. But if we want to actually live here, maybe we should do something about it. Yeah. So I love that.
I would just add, whoever asked that question has never met Natasha and does not know how powerful that woman is. So she doesn't need a team. She's got this. Carry on.
No, don't encourage the lone responsible sourcing department person. But it's interesting, Natasha, in some of your other comments, you said that you also recognize the need to really educate your entire organization. It's not just about who's in your responsible sourcing group. I liken it to safety, right? Safety should be everyone's job, right? Just like this piece should be embedded in how do you instill that in people doing their everyday jobs in the procurement function? And that's I think pretty powerful in itself.
Yeah, thanks. And I actually there is a question in there, the Q&A about, smaller companies. And, just to share very quickly an example is that, that it really needs to start within the individual person. And so even as PepsiCo with, almost 300,000 employees, we have a program called Green Teams, right? And it's all about how you as a person can make that impact.
Mm. Yeah. I think when you can embed it into who someone is as a person, it ends up getting embedded into their work. I love that. I love that idea. Okay, there are so many questions coming in. I'm trying to listen and read at the same time. Let's see if I can grab another one we haven't addressed yet. how can you provide evidence of sustainable procurement to feed stories for marketing and sales and lead change management? I love this one because communication, I think, is something we don't always do well from procurement. So I'd love if anyone on the panel can talk about that. That would be very helpful.
I can jump in on that. I've spent quite a long time trying to encourage major consumer goods organizations to talk about what they're doing in their supply chain, and they have, each of them, outrageously powerful marketing organizations that have huge influence over consumer behavior all day in, day out. And I kind of think the environmental NGO movement shot ourselves in the foot a little bit early on by punishing greenwash to such an extent. And I mean early on, because what we did was we stymied the necessary bump that needs to come with the innovation that's required to make the transition, right? And so, some people just kind of fake it till they make it sort of thing. But actually, if you got a huge, massively powerful communication tool in front of you, which is the multi-billion-dollar spend of a consumer goods organization, and you're not using that to reference at least some element of responsibility through your operations, and where you have good data and you know that you are benchmarking near the top, then you should be talking about it, even though it's
hard. Yeah, I feel that target, right?
Yeah.
You talk about one thing you're doing good that you can give lots of really cool data on, and yet you're punished for not solving world peace. I mean, it can be really challenging in a corporate environment. I see Natasha nodding and smiling. I'm sure you feel that as well. Gary, you must have lots of clients that feel that way.
I literally could write another PhD on this specific topic, and I'm not a marketer. But what I will double down on what Dexter said. I will say this. Employees want to work at companies that take their net zero strategies, their sustainability strategies, their whole ESG strategy maybe seriously. And the only way they can do that is for the company to talk about it. And if you just look at the example of Patagonia, and if I just stick in the consumer world, if you just look at the example of Patagonia and what they've been able to do, is really make sustainability and talking about their journey as a part of their brand, as a part of the thing that they're selling to consumers or to their customers in general. So I think it cuts you not just in what you sell. I think it cuts you in who you can recruit and who you can retain, because you're not talking about the work you've done. There are so many case studies at Reaply that we can't put on our website, or that I can't talk about publicly. Why? Because those companies don't want people to know, oh my gosh, you were wasting that amount, or oh my gosh, you had that much embodied carbon exposure. It's like, yes, we did, and we did something about it, and that actually becomes a competitive edge in the market. So it's quite, and I say this to all my friends who are my customers, it's quite beyond my understanding why people don't want to talk about their own progress. And I understand the point about, well, we're not focusing on the water, we're not focusing on these other things, but we have to show progress because it engenders people to get behind our brands and our companies and to stay there and to continue to do the hard work towards zero. So that's my sermon for today.
I feel that I'm big on transparency. And if you don't talk about the problems, how are you ever going to solve them? And it gets back to this collaboration, right? If you talk about problems that need a collaborative effort behind, that no one company can solve, again, if you don't talk about them, how are you gonna move forward? I have.
Can I chime in on that quickly?
Please.
Because we are not a consumer goods company. We don't have a marketing budget, and we're not selling things to others. But we are the biggest customer of a lot of these things. And I think all the work we've been talking about engaging suppliers is to push it upstream into our supply chain, because to date, suppliers have not been transparent in providing greenhouse gas emissions and embodied carbon and material information with the products they've been selling to us. We hadn't thought to ask, and they hadn't provided it. And so now we need to sort of rejig the system and engage our suppliers to get data from them. But all of this is really about what we're selling into the market too. So to go back to data, everyone thinks of scope 3, category 1, purchase goods and services, but category 11 is use of sold products. And especially as you think about science-based targets, you really need to think about your full value chain and how you're partnering with suppliers to actually provide better products into the market, and then actually engaging your customers with that data. If you're buying our product, here's the lower embodied carbon. Here's what you need to do with it to actually achieve the energy savings we're promising you on the label, so that we're not accused of greenwashing. Here's how to actually use our products. Here's what we want you to do with it when you're done with it. We want to take it back, right? Mm-hmm. So actually closing that loop will actually show up in the data and actually show up in the whole value chain. And I think that's where we haven't really fully closed the loop on things, is how we engage customers, especially when they're corporate customers or government customers who can buy this stuff at scale and actually follow the rules and actually do the thing you're asking them to do with your products. So I give a plug for category 11 of scope 3 to answer that question.
Thank you. It's very specific. I love it. Okay, so so many questions, so little time. This one's for you, Betty. Do you utilize any type of technology for achieving your sustainability goals other than CDP? Because we've talked about that a little bit. And if yes, how do you use it? If no, why not?
Any type of technology. That's a broad question.
It is pretty broad.
I will say government is not the most sophisticated in our use of technology broadly. For example, we all have different video conferencing systems we use in different agencies and can't use each other's and have no central database. However, we have increasingly better data about our suppliers, and there is a lot of action that specific agencies are taking to more intelligently manage products and services and material flows and the associated emissions with them. And especially as we think about things like driving deforestation, that's where real technology and geospatial mapping and things like that really needs to come into play, and things where we have like embodied carbon and we don't have that line of sight or that chain of custody deeper into our supply chain. That's where we're going to need to sort of adopt the best practice from the market to really move forward, and then find where there are ways that government systems can come in and provide better tools. Like we just put out this camera tool, CMRA, I believe it is, on risk mapping. So you can actually map deaths from heat waves and flooding and droughts and all these different climate risks in a very granular level using NOAA and NASA data and stuff like that. So I think there's ways that we can work with third parties, we can work with government agencies and sort of pull this data out and integrate it into tools so that we can digitize things, we can get out of Excel, and we can really be smartly managing things. But it's going to look different in all different agencies across government. Yeah, I mean, technology, like we live in a world of technology. So we're moving to 100% zero emission vehicles. We're integrating our entire transport system to be a big smart grid, right? So we're thinking about our net zero buildings work and our energy work and our zero emission vehicles and the interplay between them and how everything is powering each other as we electrify buildings, and the interplay with the grid and the interplay with our vehicles. So yeah, we're thinking about it across government and as we engage our suppliers.
So lots of different types of technology. What about them talking to each other, aggregating that data? How are you doing that today? Are you still stuck in spreadsheets and trying to aggregate, kind of, at least in this carbon footprint space? Are you stuck in that, like many of us are, or are you finding ways to utilize systems that maybe are already out there?
It's a great question. So in full disclosure, we are not very good at calculating our own greenhouse gas footprint, but something that's well underway. If you've seen our Executive Order 14057 around sustainability of the federal government, that tasks us to fully think about our greenhouse gas emissions. And the implementing instructions that we've just released about a week or two ago, they're wonky in government guidance, but they explain to all the agencies all the work that they have to do on this. So yeah, so every agency within the federal government needs to calculate its own scope 1 and 2 emissions. And luckily we have FEMP, the Federal Energy Management Program, which is a part of Department of Energy that creates the tools to be able to help agencies actually do their calculations. And then we're actually centralizing our scope 3 accounting. So we currently calculate 5 categories of scope 3. Does not include category 1, supply chain, but we are expanding our scope 3 analysis to actually cover all relevant categories of scope 3 in a federal government context. And we're going to centralize the calculation of that data using the CDP data and industry averages and other emissions factors that we need to pull in, sort of a hybrid between disclosed data and modeled data like many other companies are doing. And then we work with every agency to set their targets off of that data to actually drive the procurement action, whether they're NASA or Department of Defense or the Veterans Administration. So data flows in different ways, but yes, lots to excel.
So this reminds me of what you said before, Dexter. It's not about the data being perfect. And Betty's already like working multiple streams, right? The data's not perfect. There's not one great, big, huge set of data that you can analyze and make a decision and go forward on. They're trying to put all that data together and take action at the same time. And I think that's pretty powerful for many organizations who might be sitting here going, God, we haven't even started yet, and we're supposed to have action done. And you don't have to do it in order. Don't make great get in the way of good, right? I've heard that many times.
Exactly, and by simply asking the question of the suppliers, you are catalyzing action. So, you know, even that process of gathering that initial understanding of where everybody sits, that will start from, oh my God, these guys who spend $200 million a year, they find this to be really important. We need to take action on this. We need to sort it out. I mean, it was. When you were asking, Betty, it was generous of you to refer to CDP as a technology. We know our various shortcomings in the actual platform itself, and we're doing a lot of work on the kind of digitization of it. But one of the areas I noticed that I've been quite passionate about recently is product level data, LCA data, because I think that can empower people to make decisions very quickly. Again, it doesn't need to be perfect, but it needs to be broken down over the life cycle of the product so that you can identify where to make the intervention. Now, we've asked for that data through the CDP platform since I started there, since 2008. So it was, but it's an incredibly cumbersome question. Yields next to no useful data. It's really challenging. A very clever person did some analysis of it a while ago, and that was the last time anybody really touched it. And I was speaking about this to BCG, and we're talking about, okay, will we build? I want a solution for this in the supply chain program. I want to be able to give all of the supply chain responding companies all around the world the ability to calculate LCA for their product and to disclose that data for free to everybody. Basically, we're too keen on it, but we developed a kind of freemium idea. But basically, this platform, it's going to be called the product ecosystem. And I was looking for a link for it, which makes me think I probably broke some sort of embargo or something. But anyway, it will be launched on the 9th of November at COP. And it will be a free tool for the whole world to really get. But the point I'm making is that our technology, our CDP technology, was not up to the type of data exchange, that real-time data exchange that was needed to really make a difference in that product level data space. And that's why we developed this thing.
And how does that fit with? We just had a webinar the other day on this. Hold on, I have to go back to my other set of notes here. Environmental product disclosures, right? The ISO standard for how does that link in with that? Is it standardized or no?
Entirely aligned, and actually, it's powered by AI. So the idea is that you actually use a lot of the individual, because people will report this data, different companies will report it in slightly chaotic ways at the start. You'll have random breakdowns across SKUs that aren't standardized. We've done some work with World Business Council for Sustainable Development as part of the PACT initiative, Pathfinder initiative, which is kind of redefining LCA data methodologies. But basically, you'll need some sort of advanced technology to identify what are the common stages in the life cycle of different SKUs as we try and get down to serious granularity. And so what you need to do that is scale and technology. And that's why we've built AI into this solution, which don't ask me to explain the AI element. But
we'll have to have a whole webinar on it when it launches, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I can just add to that I think the other thing that Dexter missed is that the critical thing that underpins a lot of that is standardized lifecycle analysis data. So you need to have standardized industry average data so that each company and standardized LCA data and rules of the road, which in the case of EPDs, environmental product declarations, are these things called PCRs, or product category rules, which are like, here's the standardized industry average, here are the rules of the road of those key hotspot areas you need to include. And then since you're a company who has your own data, you can actually improve upon those areas of the standardized data process where you have raw data, and theoretically you have raw data back into your supply chain to actually identify the hotspots. So it's sort of an iterative process where there's standardized ways that the data flows to maintain its integrity on the product itself using standardized background data and then raw data where it matters. And that's a lot of roles that government can play in helping to standardize those so that there can be comparability. And I would just add that a lot of these tools have been built in the past by industry or built just for labeling purposes, not for procurement purposes. So there's a lot of hesitation to choose between products based off of lifecycle analysis or environmental product declaration data because they haven't been built in the same standardized way. And so it's not fair to compare them at times, but that's what we're working towards, is that harmonized approach. Just like we've done on the corporate side,
collaboration,
we're working on the product side.
Yeah, sounds like
you might say.
Maybe if I could just kind of build a little bit on what Dexter and Betty and Gary have sort of talked about, and which is around sort of data, okay? And, you know, I think you mentioned it, Judy, you can't let perfection get in the way of progress, right? And so we know that even the emissions factor on different ingredients changes year on year, or we don't have it right down to the actual state or province or region that we're sourcing that commodity or crop from. So there's still, you know, quite a lot of information and details that need to be made available, right, as it evolves. But, you know, one thing that we need to kind of look at is that, you know, when we look at our data, it needs to be directionally correct, right? Are we heading in the right direction? Yes. Great. Let's go. And, you know, I think someone in the chat box or the Q&A asked a question, I think, about, you know, what was the response from our suppliers about, you know, what we thought about, you know, where they are on the journey. And, you know, part of that is, you know, this is about our activation around our engagement. And, you know, we're launching, you know, PEP Positive 360, which is essentially a collaborative conversation. So to Dexter's point, the fact that you're even asking your suppliers and partners, you know, are you reporting on scope 1 and 2? Have you thought about science-based target? You're already, you know, sending those signals out there. And so, you know, that needs to be a very much a holistic approach that you take with each of your suppliers to understand where they are on the journey, how it aligns with your targets and goals, and how you can work together to get there, to whether that's through innovation, collaboration, working on the ground with partners, and what does that look like? And the way you get there is by doing that together.
Awesome. Thank you, Natasha. We have another question out here for you on that set of suppliers that you're engaging, right? So how do you evaluate the responses from those top 20% of suppliers who impacted 80% of emissions? Was there any weightage scoring criteria? Do you have a scorecard, I think is what the question is.
The question is do we, yeah, that's right, Judy, do we have a scorecard? Well, this is, you know, as I said, this is our PEP Positive 360. It's the holistic conversation that we're having, right? And how we're going to work collaboratively. You know, what are the resources that they need to put in place to better understand how to report on scope 1 and 2, you know, how to, you know, work with, how to set a science-based target, how to get it validated by SBTi. Right? Mm-hmm. And so, you know, that's what we're working towards certainly in the next year or so, is making sure we're having those conversations about what's the action that's needed to be able to move the needle on many of these, targets and commitments that we have.
And Judy, can I just chime in a little bit here? Because
Please.
I think I really love the comment that Natasha talked about with directionality. Most organizations' problem is so massive. Thinking about, are we off a few decimal points and how we're thinking about this carbon and that carbon is literally not significant, like both mathematically and also like in total impact. So one of the things that beyond if there's not great SEO data or great data that we can bring to a reuse program, one of the things that we try to think about is surrogates, right? So if you think about, are we diverting as much waste as we want? Are we diverting more waste? Are we diverting less waste by tonnage? That's probably a good surrogate to maybe you have a little bit more or less scope 3 carbon exposure than you did year over year, to that last point. How are we doing on water? So there are other things outside. There's a very famous meme that most people know about, like people looking just at the carbon problem, and there's all these other biodiversity, water, waste problems that are all about climate change. So I also like to think of it from a wholesome sustainability perspective, not just a carbon perspective, because measuring the weight of something, thinking about water, is something that you can do without a tool, kind of, although we do that at Replay for you. But you don't need to have long chain up and down value calculations of your supply chain. So I would also kind of encourage, are we directionally improving other KPIs around the whole sustainability picture as a surrogate to when data is unclear around the carbon side of things?
Yeah, I agree with that. I always have lots of assumptions when working with data. It's funny, I've had a few different kind of younger in their career people and some interns working on some of our metrics, and I have to remind them that it's not going to be to the penny. It's not going to be perfect. We just have to document our assumptions, document where we know we've got some challenges in data. And it's hard when you're a data person and you just, when I was an intern and the petty cash was mine to manage, I wanted it to be to the penny, right? And so I've spent my entire career trying to stop that kind of perfectionist aspect of myself in the data, and really take a step back and look at what are we having impact that we want, right? And it's not ever going to be perfect. So thank you for that. And thank you, Natasha, for talking about the directionality. I am not sure if I've gotten to any questions. Sarah, if you're out there monitoring, is there one that I missed that we really should get addressed with this panel, this amazing panel? I know there's been some monitoring out there. Anyone from SLC?
I think, there's a great one from Nicole Darnall at ASU, who does a lot of work on procurement, sustainable procurement enabling around thinking about the massive amount of supplier training, particularly, I think, directed at you, Betty, that will be required as we go forward. Obviously, PepsiCo as well. All of us are facing this, we're going to hit the wall of tens of thousands of people saying they don't know how to do this. So I guess some comment on that and where you're going with it would be great.
Well, luckily, we're not asking folks to do anything in 2022 that we haven't already asked them to do for a few years, if not decades. So, the GHG protocol was founded in 2000. So some of us have had over 20 years of practice on this, and the standards have been evolving, and they still need some more evolution, as we've been discussing on this, right? Scope 3 could use a little bit of an overhaul. Scope 2 could use a little more love now that we've learned all sorts of new ways to procure renewable energy and integrate them into our footprint. Maybe we'll even readdress Scope 1 as we get over some bridges of different types of fossil fuels. But this stuff is not new, and so we have there's lots of free tools out there that we're going to be building a toolkit that we can point suppliers to. There are a lot of support groups, and then there's folks like SDLC who are out there training folks how to do this. So I think as we've gotten smarter, there's a lot more software, there's a lot more knowledge and capability, but it still requires human power. And when people complain to me about how much data we require them to report, I remind them that they have a green job and we can't really automate it. So we're going to keep demanding more data from you next year. And that's what's growing all of our incredible sustainability professionals. And that's on the data provision side. We also need all the data users. So that's where procurement really comes in, is sucking that data in. Folks like Natasha really thinking about how to slice and dice and evaluate and engage the suppliers again and say, thanks for disclosing, but like, we can't use this because it's junk, or hey, you might want to use this tool to improve, or here's a collaborative opportunity. So I think, the data, as we've been discussing, is sort of the starting point and the ending point, but it's the bookends for all the stuff we need to do to actually decarbonize. And it takes a crew of professionals. I said earlier that procurement was going to save the world. Maybe procurement and accountants are going to save the world. I'll amend.
And Judy, can I add to that, just even broader than a supplier, but just the professional? So a couple of things that I've been doing, and we've been doing at Reaply. So one thing is we have webinars for our clients' employees to come learn. We call it Carbon 101. Come learn about these Scope 1. What does this mean? What does this include? What is circularity? What are these words? One of the things we find is like the lexicon that we use as sustainable professionals can sometimes not include everyone into that conversation. So what we try to do is try to like bring employees the same way that their sustainability leaders are, kind of have that same knowledge base. This is a part of our reuse program. We're now broadening that to anyone. So anyone, that doesn't have to be a customer of Reaply, they can join these kind of monthly webinars where we talk about all kind of issues, but do so at a level that I would say that my 96-year-old grandmother can understand. The other thing that I've been trying to do is I spend a lot of time in business schools. So I go to business schools and I give very standard lectures around circular economy, circularity, reuse, carbon 101, carbon economy, all these things, so that if you're going to be a leader in business, you should be knowing about these things. And I've already written about how business schools should start teaching kind of just like basic level sustainability knowledge. You shouldn't have to have a master's in sustainability to understand that every business is affected by climate change on a go-forward basis. So I think for vendors like Reaply, even though we're really focused on reuse, it still is important to educate every employee who might be one day a supplier about how these issues affect them, and kind of make it in a language under which they can really grab onto and engage with.
I love that. Absolutely. Natasha, Dexter, you're going to say something?
No, Natasha.
I had a question for Natasha that along these lines. You came up with a few areas to create a toolkit for. Can you talk about how you got to kind of those areas that you wanted to build the supplier capacity building in your supply base around?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so I suppose they're all linked to our supplier ask, right? And, one of them is, renewable energy. It's one of the easiest levers we can ask our suppliers to move towards and transition towards. But to be able to do that, they need to understand the availability in those different markets. They need to understand how to, do they set up a power purchasing agreement, right, or not, and who would be in that cohort? And I have to say, to Gary's point, the number of acronyms out there, right? I mean, you could have an encyclopedia of sustainability acronyms and still not cover it, right? And it would still be growing. So there is that whole piece around ensuring that we are teaching sustainability and educating at various levels, right? And what's really needed. Okay. And so all of our pieces are about education and, good practices, and really demystifying things like a science-based target, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, that's where we need to start to build from, so that we can increase our own levels of knowledge of sustainability, but also that of our colleagues and of our suppliers.
Awesome. Thank you. Have you had any specific feedback from your suppliers who may have not even been on the journey when you started engaging them, but now are like enthusiastic advocates?
Yeah, we have actually. And so I suppose one supplier who, was maybe small to medium-sized supplier, we enrolled them in the ESOT, the Guidehouse program. And a first part of that is understanding what their footprint is and how to measure it, right? And then they need to put in place the plan and set a science-based target. And I think Renee said something about aspiration, right? They had an aspiration to set a science-based target, and they've done it, and it's been validated by the Science-Based Target Initiative. So they are feeling really great, and we're feeling really great, and we know that it's about that action. They've now taken that action. They've got the plan in place. It's all moving forward.
That's great. I love feeling success stories from capacity building. It's very exciting. All right, so we have about 3 minutes. I'd like to go around the panel and ask, if you have a parting thought on this collaboration and innovation in the GSG space, particularly in how procurement has a role. I would love to have a quick thought. Anyone want to start?
I can start because I think I want to listen to the other folks' prescription. I'm just very thankful for the invitation and to be with some of I kind of like fanboy Natasha Chizano on LinkedIn, so I'm like super fan of what she does. So I just want to say that one of the easiest to implement ways to actually reduce scope 3 exposure is through having a reuse program. If you have a procurement system, you should have a reuse program. We build reuse programs at Repley, but even if you don't have ours, have a spreadsheet, have a listserv, have something of which people can actually operate this at scale. And even if you don't work with us, connect with us. One of our core values at Repley is to be helpful. So even if we can just help you think about reuse and circular, we would love to connect. So I leave you with that. And thank you for the time, Judy, and the organization.
Thank you, Gary. And I'm a fangirl of yours, so definitely. All right, who's next? Anyone? Natasha?
I can go next. Well, I think, I suppose my parting thoughts are around collaboration and innovation, right? And so, that piece around collaboration actually really starts within your own organisation as well. And so I would really encourage people to think about collaborating with your colleagues internally, even though you think maybe that's not going to get me where I'm going to be, because you never know who has the best idea and what's going to move forward. And collaboration is internal, it's external with suppliers, but it's also across industries and with governments. And so if we can start to move in that direction, maybe we'll get to where we need to be. So thank you for the opportunity, and, fantastic to be with such a wonderful panel. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Natasha. And if you don't know where to start with collaboration, and there's not an organization that's already doing it for the type of collaboration you're looking for, come to SPLC and ask us, because we could probably put something together. There's probably plenty of people asking the same question. Betty or Dexter, parting thoughts?
Sure, I can jump in next. I guess I have a sort of insight and a request, if I could be so bold. So I guess, building on the theme of collaboration and data, don't believe the hype. Scope 3 is hard, but not that hard, and we don't need to get it perfect to get started. So don't forget about the data, but don't obsess over the data, because getting perfect Scope 3 will not solve climate change. Getting good Scope 3 will point us in the direction of the places we need to be addressing to solve climate change. So don't believe the hype, get smart about it, and drive the action while you're working on the data. But what you should believe that the hype is that the federal government is taking action on this. So I've only talked about things that are publicly available and publicly tasked of me. However, I will indicate that we have 3 proposed FAR cases in the Federal Acquisition Regulation that will be coming up over the coming months that will integrate what I've been talking about into federal purchasing law. And those are open for public comment for 60-day periods. There will probably be folks who think that things like Scope 3 are very difficult to do, and the federal government has no business working on things like climate change in our procurement. So if you care at all about this, please keep an eye out and provide public comments from yourself, from your organization, from your industry groups, to support us and tell us what we need to be fixing to help make sure that as we write these into final rules, we get it right. So the first one up will be around risk and resiliency and disclosure, as I've mentioned. The second one will be around eco-label products and services. And the third will be around minimizing the risks of climate through procurement, which includes all the acquisition innovations that we're working on. So keep an eye out and publicly comment. Participatory
Awesome.
Government at Work.
Good